In a previous video, we showed you how to make clay from dirt. Now, the next level is to take that clay and make it into something useful, like a pot. And so, we need to learn something about pottery. I've never taken a pottery class before, and so I did the logical thing. I went on campus at my university and I found a ceramics professor. What follows is an interview with Dr. Christensen, where I asked him about what makes a good clay. Then we followed an interesting thought about how pottery might be the grandmother of science. What makes a good clay, and how do you tell?
Well, a good clay is relative to what you need to use it for. Since you're applying this to pottery forms, there are a number of good things that I can see about this one. One, that it's fairly plastic. It doesn't, without having really mixed anything into it, it shrinks without cracking, and it seems that your coils are able to bend in a plastic way without being short. It hardens in the firing fairly well, and so it seems like you ran into a good earthenware
That's awesome.
Could be pretty functional for a number of things.
How rare is it that you find a clay that's just completely unusable for making forms?
It's more like, how rare is it to find a clay that's completely usable as is? It's more typical to blend different kinds of clays to try to come up with something that's workable.
Okay. Interesting.
So you know, this is a nice source because it has some good properties as is.
What kind of properties are you looking for? So you mentioned plasticity.
Plasticity is a good one. I guess the main one for workability. The other one would be there's such a thing as clays that are too plastic. For instance, you'll find silt-based clays that they may be good for a slip glaze, but they are, for a clay body, they shrink too much and they crack a lot because of their shrinkage. And so this one seems like it must be mixed with elements that shrink less and yet maintains a good plasticity. So that's
Are those traits tied to the particle size of the clay?
well, yeah. Actually, they could be tied to particle size. Like the structure of clay will be based in silica, which is basically sand, and it's what most of the Earth's crust is made out of. And another element is alumina. It's what makes clay not melt under heat. And the third element is water.
In discovering how all these things work, in identifying what clays work and what ones don't, and how to do these glazing, is there any way to predict before you try it?
Before testing? Let's see, to predict what? Like how well it will work?
How well it will work, what it will look like, what its functional...
Not really. Firing is the best test.
Interesting. I've wondered if pottery, ceramics might not have been the grandmother of science because of all the chemistry.
It was the grandmother of a lot of technology, actually. So if you look at things like casting metal, so we classify the ages of human development as the Stone Age and the Bronze Age, the Iron Age. Those all have to do with the technology of metal casting. And metal casting depends on ceramic technology because first they had to develop clay crucibles that would go to a high enough temperature to melt metal. Usually that means stoneware clay, not earthenware clay, because the earthenware would melt at the temperature that they needed to melt the metal.
So the testing of clays, so you can't test them until you fire them. How would that be for the first ever potters? I mean,
Well, of course we don't know because people were making pottery at the same time they were doing cave paintings. In many cases, I think pottery's contemporary with Altamira or Lascaux or Chauvet. You know, those cave paintings. There's some ceramic technology connected with those. In fact, if you look at like the Venus of Willendorf, there's clay figures that are similar to that one, which is carved out of stone.
that's I wonder, because they were processing mineral pigments for those paintings. Do you think
Sure.
that there's a connection between?
Oh, I'm sure, but like when we look back that far, I'm guessing that ceramics were invented as a result of just having campfires and discovering what happens to the earth after a campfire, maybe making a ball of clay and tossing it into the fire, maybe even something that you'd made like a figurine or something, and discovering that it became permanent when it comes into contact with fire. And from there, you know, very early on, you see things like bowls that are functional, and so it would be, you know, bowls are an extension of your hand. So either, you know, you pick up water in your hands and drink it like that, or you have something else. So it could be that they were carving wood and so forth, and then transferred. That most cultures worldwide, before the invention of the potter's wheel, ceramics were done by women, and which you can see, you know, through the handprints that we see. There's exceptions to everything, but worldwide pottery making was connected with the kitchen and cooking and things like that, and became women's work. But with the invention of the potter's wheel, you see a tendency toward like other technologies, it being taken over by men. And but then there's interesting exceptions to that, like there's quite a bit of evidence to female medieval potters in Europe and so forth. So
Wow.
so you can see some like social dynamics that are connected with it, but ceramics also had a lot to do with agriculture, because lining ditches with clay. It doesn't have to be fired clay. It can be just clay. Once it's wet, resists water, and so it keeps irrigation canals from seeping into the ground and so forth. So that was important later on. For instance, in the Roman Empire, there were lead pipes, but what was even more common, which was actually a big problem, it ended up poisoning people before they understood what happens with lead. But there was much more clay tubing that went on with that, and in Islamic cultures, there was a lot of clay tubing that went into transporting water and so forth, which also added to technologies like windmills and things that were invented in the Middle East. It was a huge technological invention. It had to do with storing food, which facilitated the growth of agricultural societies, and it also allowed for trade with vessels. We can see in the history of the Mediterranean through shipwrecks and so forth that pottery had to do with merchant industries, and every vessel was stocked with ceramic vessels with goods that traded back and forth across the Mediterranean, and it was much the same in the Far East, where we see far-flung trade. We can see trade going on between the Arabian Peninsula and East Asia very early on.
It's an interesting thought. You can't know if a clay is really good until you've worked with it, until you've experienced it and tested it. And then you can't know at what temperature it fires until you've fired it. And you can't know what colors it'll be until you fire it. And so there's this testing and experimenting and iterated thing going on that is very scientific. It makes you really wonder if this wasn't the birthplace of it all. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe below, and please hit the like button and share the video with your pottery friends, or maybe just your friends in general.